Well, we're fortunate to have with us today Jeff Speck, who is an urban planner, author, and advocate. Jeff has worked with dozens of towns and cities across America and the world over the last few decades to make their landscapes more walkable.
As an author, Jeff has co-authored the bestseller Suburban Nation and this best-selling book, Walkable City, How Downtown Can Save America One Step at a Time.
And you may have seen Jeff on TED Talks and on YouTube, where his videos have been viewed millions of times. We're speaking to Jeff today. I think you're only a few towns away from us here in the studio.
Anyway, we're all in Massachusetts.
That's right. It was great that you could make some time for us today, Jeff, and we're happy to be discussing transportation and planning and how to generally make our planet a little bit more fun and healthy to live on. So welcome, Jeff.
Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. And, I'm not much on YouTube, but for this occasion, I did go on and check out some of your videos, and it's very impressive stuff, and it's great the message you're sharing with your audience. I think I'm perhaps visiting you as the annual Luddite. I might be the person this year or maybe this decade who maybe is the most suspicious of technology and the most concerned about the impacts of technology on society. But I do want to point out, since you guys are such Tesla fans, that I've almost always been a car nut. And I've had this incredible kind of cognitive dissonance in my brain around loving cars, and then as a city planner and someone who's trying to make communities more vital, slowly over the years realizing that it's principally car culture that has been destructive to our public realm and to our, the success of public spaces. And we can talk about the details and how we redesign spaces so that cars have less of an impact. But, I know that you guys like me are also focused on saving this planet, and the much more global, comprehensive impacts that cars have had when you really do the research is quite discouraging.
Well, yeah, I want to get right into your book. I think on page 141, you had this quote that really stopped me in my tracks. In 1902, you said every U.S. city with a population of 10,000 or more had its own streetcar system. These were torn out in a vast criminal conspiracy that is as well documented as it was inevitable. And then the footnote you have there, Alfred Sloan Jr., faced in 1922 with record losses, teamed up with Standard Oil, Phillips Petroleum Tire and Rubber, and Mack Truck to create a shell company, National City Lines, quote, to quietly buy up the nation's mass transit agencies and scrap the electric trains they operated. National City Lines could then replace the trains with buses made and fueled by the conspirators. In the process, it could reduce mass transit service and promote automobile sales as more convenient option to millions of consumers. Also, although the conspiracy was proven in court, the corporations involved were fined only $5,000, and the executives fined just $1 apiece because the judge determined that there wasn't much anyone could do about the lost mass transit. Wow. Can you talk to us a little bit about this? Because I think many people don't know about this part of our history.
Well, this is the theme of that movie, Who Killed Roger Rabbit, right? So it's pretty well known. I'm not much of a conspiracy theorist myself, but this is the one conspiracy that is the most relevant when it comes to how our communities look today. I think it's important to understand, and I think I go on in the book to say, it's important to understand that this was very much a mass cultural movement as well. And the auto manufacturers did a great job at inventing this concept. They actually created the term, the love affair with the automobile, and selling it to the American public. But that it wasn't like America's transit riders were upset about it. There was this mass national excitement about this amazing new technology, the privately owned automobile that would give each one of us the ability to go wherever we want, whenever we want. But it is important to understand that that national attitude was very much created by the advertising industry and funded by the automakers. And of course, there was this revolving door between the automakers and the Department of Transportation, and also the federal government, which subsidized sprawl in several really important ways. Of course, the billion dollar highway program, which continues to this day, but also the idea that you could, the fact that due to FHA and VA loan programs, you could actually leave your apartment in the city, abandon your decrepit urban apartment and move into a brand new house being built in the suburbs in Levittown and end up an owner instead of a renter and be paying the same or less per month because of the way these programs worked. And by the way, they were only available to white people. That's something that got swept under the carpet for many years and is now well known. But there was this tremendous government subsidization and, ad world selling of this concept of automobility that made no one really willing or wanting to punish the automakers for this conspiracy. They bought up the lines, replaced the lines with buses, which were brand new and pretty sexy at that point, but then cut bus service pretty quickly. So people were left kind of dependent on their own automobiles. I think it's wonderful to go, I have experienced that it's wonderful to go to those few cities in the U.S., right, like San Francisco, that have not scrapped their transit systems in this way, the streetcar systems. For me, it was eye-opening in Australia to go to Melbourne, and by far the best life. I mean, Sydney's spectacular. You've probably been there, but you haven't visited there yet on your World Tesla tour. Sydney is spectacular, but Melbourne is so delightful to walk around. And what I realized in Melbourne is you have street after street, main streets, that have streetcars running down the middle of them, just like we did all over the U.S. And I've never seen so many linear feet or linear miles of non-chain retail. And I realized that it was the densities that the streetcars attract, the way the neighborhoods collect in a linear way along those axes, and the energy that they brought that caused that allowed them to maintain a society in which every store was independent and unique.
Well, that leads me to page 151 of your book. You said, weren't they just short-term value creation strategies by real estate developers? And I had never thought of it that way. I didn't even know that was a thing. That it seems like now cities are trying to bring them back if they've gotten rid of them, or trying to keep them if they have them.
And they feel like this paragon of virtue that some amazing person were putting in these streetcars, but of course they were just real estate developers that wanted to bring some more value to a neighborhood.
Right.
Particularly because of that passage in the book, I'm known as being a bit of a realist. To the degree that I'm known, I'm known as being a realist on these issues. The streetcar, which we actually refer to streetcars not as transit, but as pedestrian accelerators, in the sense that you're never going to build a truly regional, efficient transit system just on streetcars, because they actually move rather slowly, right? But you are going to use them within neighborhoods to tie neighborhoods together. But the fact that you cite is that almost every, I've heard don't have the data, but I've heard that every streetcar system that was built in the U.S. Was built by a real estate developer who had some property that was on the edge of town, where the edge of town existed at that time, right? Soon to be moved. That had property on the edge of town, and the streetcar, which was a significant investment, they never paid for themselves, right? They brought the downtown values to the edge of town because they brought the people to the edge of town. And so they were a very wise investment strategy. And what you find now is that the new streetcar systems that are most successful and most ridden, like the one in Portland, Oregon, and the one in Seattle, were built again in the same way, that they were funded principally by people who owned real estate at one end of the line.
Wasn't Cedar Rapids originally, like at the end of the line, they had, I think it was called like a picnic area. And then one day they put in a ride. And then I think it turned into Cedar Rapids, what we know of it today. And of course, the trolley line has since disappeared. But it was basically funded by having that trolley line, which would bring people to this picnic area, which is, of course, outside of the downtown. You can't picnic in downtown. But it was so popular.
I wasn't aware of that story. I've done a ton of work in Cedar Rapids, so it
might not be Cedar Rapids. It's one of those theme parks that the non-Disney, non-Six Flags kind of theme parks.
Oh no, Cedar Rapids is a city.
Okay, then I'm sorry. What is it called? Oh my goodness.
I've also worked in Grand Rapids, also not an amusement park.
Right.
Well, and that's kind of like where we are here in Westford, Massachusetts. There used to be trolleys that would run from like Lowell to get people out here to go to the lakes. Those have since gone away, but you see the pictures of them.
And there still is a grassy strip with a telephone line running over it through parts of town as it turns into a road and then not a road anymore, but it goes straight in.
And that leads me to my question, Jeff. What's the big deal about walking? Like, why do we need people walking?
I've never been asked it in exactly that way, and I am the walkability guy. But in my book, Walkable City, I also have a copy right here. I have 3 chapters dedicated to why walkability and 3 different reasons that walkability is so important. I've since, in my newer book, Walkable City Rules, added 2 more. But it's important to understand that as a city planner, me and my colleagues, we argued for many years to try and convince people to make cities more walkable. And we found that we weren't really necessarily selling the idea particularly well. And then I realized about 20 years ago that there were these 3 other groups, the economists, the environmentalists, and the epidemiologists, who are each making their own arguments about, not as planners, but just, for their own personal interests, well, not to serve them personally, but looking at the fields that they were focused in, about why making places more walkable was so important. So we all know, walking itself is, I think, an unmitigated good. It's good for our bodies and our hearts and our minds. There's a whole literature about why walking is so great for our development and our cognition as humans. But this was looking very specifically at 3 different things: how we've actually bankrupted ourselves as a society to the degree that we're struggling. We've bankrupted our society by tying ourselves to the most expensive form of transportation possible, honestly. And Americans spend more than twice on transportation than almost any other developed nation because we've chosen that model. And then on the other side of the economic argument, how much more, and this is the succor to the developers, is how much more profitable places are and how much more desirable places are when you make them walkable. The environmental arguments are very clear. There was some confusion for a while, and the environmentalist movement in the U.S. grew up as if you think about it, it grew up as an anti-city movement. The earliest environmentalists, and for quite some time after, were all about getting people to move to the country and enjoy the country and experience nature. And they looked down on cities as dirty, and they were, right? Dirty and polluting. And this was only reinforced by the early days of carbon investigation, because the carbon maps of the country look like the night sky imagery of the country: hottest in the cities, cooler in the suburbs, black, dark in the countryside, because people were measuring carbon per square mile. And that made sense. Why not measure carbon that way? Until you realize that there's only so many of us in the country at any given time, and we can choose to live where we have a larger carbon footprint or a smaller carbon footprint. And when they started mapping carbon per household or per person, the maps just flipped. The red became the green became the red, and the clear data, which, by the way, is principally from driving, the clear data showed that the more urban a place you live in, the much lighter carbon footprint you're going to have. So that pushed the environmentalist movement in a whole other direction. How can we get more people to live in dense, walkable places? And how can we make our existing places, even our suburban ones, our sprawling ones, how can we make them more walkable, more bikeable? And then the epidemiological argument, I like to say the best day to be an urban planner in the U.S. was August 7th, 2004, when a book came out that was called Urban Sprawl and Public Health. And these 3 epidemiologists, these doctors, including the guy who ended up being Arnold Schwarzenegger's health czar in California, basically said the reason why we have the first generation of Americans who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents is because we've engineered out of our society the useful walk. That walking no longer serves a purpose. People are only walking for exercise, and they do that for a couple of weeks after New Year's, and then they stop. And how can we make up for the fact that we've created an urban design condition where we're allowing our bodies to atrophy? And so, of course, the American diet sucks. It's calories in, but it's also calories out. And, any number of health advocates have realized that it's not just getting exercise, it's creating communities where exercise, active mobility is just a natural part of our daily lives. The other two categories I added very quickly, I'll say very quickly that I added, also discussed in the update. This is a 10th anniversary update of Walkable City, was equity. And if you look at the data, of course, the people who are walking the most to work, surprisingly biking the most to work, are from the lower income brackets. Fully 38.5% of people who use a bicycle in their commute are from the lowest 25% of income earners. Yet biking has this image of this elite elite white male activity. We call them the mammals, the middle-aged men in Lycra, who are are seen biking everywhere. And also that, of course, who is dying the most on the roads, who's being killed in traffic in much higher numbers is poor people and people of color. Native Americans and blacks are twice as likely to be killed as pedestrians than white folks, for example. And then finally, community is the fifth category, and just how much better community thrives in low traffic environments. One study back in the 80s comparing streets that were identical in every aspect except the amount of traffic that were on them found that folks who lived on the low traffic street counted on average 3 good friends. They had 3 friends they considered great friends. People who lived on the high traffic street counted on average 0.9 good friends. So I always say, heavy traffic for those days when you want to have slightly less than one friend. Long answer to a very broad question. My focus, of course, used to be much more on convincing communities that they want to be more walkable. Now I find I don't have to do that so much. And they already want to be more walkable. And then the question is, what can they do in short order to achieve that?
Well, and I think it's funny when you talk about walkability, Americans will go to great lengths to bring themselves and their families to walkable places. And of course, I'm talking about, Epcot, Disney World, or, even within a city, say like City Walk or Europe, of course. I think very fondly of like Burlington, Vermont. They have, one whole street where there are crossings, but the whole street is a pedestrian zone. And you just think of that area as like all of the different things that you get to do and all of the different, chain and also, but non-chain businesses that are along it.
Right. Like the promenade in Santa Monica. Like these are all very desirable because I think you're totally right. Inside all of us, we kind of know that that's a way more fun place to be community-wise and fun-wise. And so we are attracted to go there, but they're not in our cities.
Yeah, I think the experience of being in society as a human versus as a driver are fundamentally different, right? When you're in a car, everyone else in your environment exists in only one of 2 ways. They're either competing for asphalt with you or they could kill you, right, with their car. And that makes you a very, aggressive and protective, let's just say not your best self. Right, I've never given someone the bird while walking. Although in New York City, I've been tempted a few times. But I always say it's very different to bump into someone as a pedestrian than as a driver. And of course, when you're moving to a new place, let's say, and you want to meet people, you can imagine those 2 experiences of moving to a more walkable place. Bring a dog with you, right? You're going to have a girlfriend or boyfriend in a few weeks. Whereas if everyone's driving everywhere, it's a very different situation.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I was very lucky as a kid. We would go to Europe a lot and we would hang out in piazzas in Italy and stuff. And you just see kids running around, pick-up soccer games starting everywhere. It's late at night and the parents are having fun in the cafes while the kids are off running around. You come to America, that I can't even think of a place where you can do that here. And it seems so odd since we got a lot of our foundations from Europe and yet we didn't bring that one over here. Why can't we get that back in American cities? Why can't we have plazas back here?
Well, I think we did. We certainly brought it over. We then lost it when we decided to give our public spaces over to the car. I think, it's very important to make a distinction between admiring good cars as these wonderful machines but acknowledging that they've had a very negative impact on our culture and our health and our society and our climate and so many other things. But to recognize that it's possible to still have cars, but to put them in their place. More importantly, to understand that, as the famous Scandinavian planner Jan Gehl says, it says, looking back at the 20th century, what we've learned is that cars essentially behave like water. Those cities that gave cars more space, the cars took it. Those cities that gave cars less space, the cars kept to where they were limited. I just got back from Slovenia, which is the capital of, Ljubljana, which is the capital of Slovenia, and a number of cities in Croatia, most of which were designed at a point where you just can't get cars into them. I mean, there's no room in these 6-foot streets for cars to exist. And life continues, life works. These cities, Ljubljana isn't just a tourist city, it's a real functioning capital, but the car behaves. It's got a very large pedestrian center, and the economics of driving, where particularly in the U.S., we pay a small fraction of the true cost of our driving, and we can get into that if you like. But it's been estimated that for every dollar we spend to drive, our society, i.e. our taxes, are paying about $9 to support that choice. So in that condition, driving is what economists refer to as a free good. A free good is something that, you don't pay anywhere near the full cost of. The other famous statement is, of course there's not enough parking. If pizza were free, would there be enough pizza, right? So that's how free goods function. So given that we've set up the automobile as a free good, and the smart thing to do if you own a car is to drive it all the time. Every mile costs less than the mile before. 4/5 of the costs are fixed and 1/5 of the costs are variable. So given that once you own the car and you're paying for the insurance already, and and you've paid for the car, or you're paying for the car, given that then driving is very cheap, the smart thing to do if you have a car is to drive it all the time. So this is the framework that we're operating in, the economic framework that we're making decisions within when we are given a little more asphalt. So in any city, when you add a lane, let's say you're adding a lane to reduce traffic, well, that's not going to happen. It never has happened. The classic first law of induced demand says that when you add a lane of traffic to a highway or to a street network, 40% of that new capacity is taken up immediately, and all of it's taken up within 4 years, because people adjust their behavior because they're trying to use these cars as much as they can, right? So the principal lesson from Jan Gehl in Copenhagen, or from us here with our own experience, is that we can have the cities we want. We can decide how much we're going to drive, how dependent people are going to be on automobiles, how safe it is to walk around. Each of us individually and collectively in our communities can make the choice to be more automotive or more walkable. I think the punchline is that when you try to make a place better for cars, it doesn't, right? When you try to make a place better for people, by limiting the degree to which cars are dominant, that really has a positive impact on everyone's quality of life. But when you take the alternative approach, which was the dominant approach for 50 years, and say, let's make it smooth and easy driving, because of the law and induced demand, all you really got from that was more traffic, more lanes of more traffic. So when we go to cities to work, it's a battle, because people perceive that any reduction in lanes, for example, is going to ruin their lives. In fact, people adjust very quickly to modifications in the traffic network, particularly if you provide alternatives like bike lanes and good sidewalks and ideally transit.
And you're basically taking that fire hose, which is induced demand, which typically grows with the number of people that can, especially when we talk about sprawl. Adding another lane means that now I can live another, mile or so down the track. But of course, there's always this huge demand to want to be closer to wherever it is that you're commuting to. But instead, what you can do is take that induced demand and apply it to other things like bike trails or pedestrian zones, like or pedestrian walking paths and stuff like that.
You can also induce pedestrian demand. Not so much because, I guess it's a free good because walking is pretty free, right? But also because people just get so much out of it. it's reminding me of the induced demand discussion. I have a few quotes here. And I have a wonderful quote from Elon Musk, who I think you're familiar with, on the topic of autonomous vehicles. Because many of us in the planning community are very wary, concerned about autonomous vehicles. We're skeptical of the safety benefits and other things, but one of the biggest concerns is, as Elon says, quote, self-driving cars will amplify traffic to insane levels as you won't feel the pain of driving yourself. And if you think about the fact that the principal way that we're made to pay for our driving lives is through sitting in traffic, because it's essentially a free good and driving around is much cheaper than the true cost. What influences our choice whether to occupy a roadway or not? And it's essentially whether we're going to be stuck in traffic or not. But when that time stuck in traffic is time that you can be getting work done or watching cat videos or having sex or whatever it's going to be that people are doing in their autonomous vehicles, all of a sudden it's a different story. And I think Elon is right to point that out.
This is where we kind of disagree with Elon. I don't think he walked down the steps far enough. I think he just is working so hard on the problem of autonomy that he didn't think about what life will actually look like once we have it. I actually am in the camp that we won't have worse traffic, that we'll have way less traffic, because we won't have as many cars on the road at any given time when we have autonomy. So as you already know, if you reduce the number of cars during, say, rush hour by a small percentage, you drastically reduce the amount of traffic. And so all we have to do is actually just lower the number of autonomous cars by a small amount, and we won't have the traffic we have. That's number one. Number two is that humans driving cars is why you have traffic. If you have a looky-loo who slows down to look at an accident on a highway, we all know the snake effect that happens. That won't happen with autonomy, and that is most of traffic today. Thirdly, accidents are caused by humans largely will go away once we have autonomy. Not that they'll be perfect, but we'll reduce the number of accidents by so much that we won't have that problem as well. Not to mention looking for parking. In most cities, 30% of traffic is caused by people looking for parking. Again, autonomous cars don't need to park. So I think, we did a whole 10-part series on this. I think that that's actually not going to happen. I know that's why Elon's working on the Boring Company, so he can have tunnels, because he thinks that'll alleviate it. But I think there's going to be this pretty miraculous thing that happens when we have autonomous cars. And that kind of leads us into, I don't know, I noticed in your book, you mentioned around page 90 that removing cars from downtowns actually killed a lot of downtowns. If you think of places like, cities basically where they made it hard to get into the city with the cars, a lot of cities experienced all their businesses kind of dried up, right? And so we only have places left that you pointed out, like Santa Monica, where there's still the car and there's still super ritzy places, but that's kind of odd in America. And so I wanted to talk about the fact that I think with autonomous cars, we're actually going to be helping downtowns, because we're going to take the worst part of cars out of it. So, what I think of is the bad parts of cars: the pollution, the traffic, the fact that they're not used 95% of the time. So of course you have to park them, which leads to the parking problem. So that's gone. Safety largely goes away. Cost largely goes away. And fossil fuel use largely goes away. So there's still a problem. You still have cars, but they're now way safer, way cheaper. We're not parking them. And I feel like that's the part of the cars that we both agree on that we want to get rid of. And I think autonomy gets rid of it. And I'd love to discuss that part of it.
Yeah, and before we're done, I want to talk about other technologies that I think we agree on that are having a real impact right now in making cities so much better. But the basis of my skepticism about autonomous vehicles comes from several different categories. You're probably aware of this recent university study that was completed where they did their best to emulate what it would be like for people to have autonomous vehicles, and they basically gave a whole bunch of people chauffeurs. Did you hear about this study? And they made it, obviously a chauffeur has benefits. If you're a social person, you want to be with people more. I think more people would probably be even more interested in an autonomous vehicle than a chauffeured vehicle, because they could have privacy and not have this other person hanging around. But in any case, in this university study, they gave people chauffeurs and saw how it would impact their travel behavior, and they ended up driving around 80% more. So that's one thing to pay attention to. The other thing that I think challenges your autonomous argument is I think it's based on the foundation of an unrealistic understanding of how American government operates and how top-down our governments are willing to be. Because American municipalities, let's not even look at the federal or state level, but American municipalities have never had the nerve to tell any American where they could take their car at any time. And I say that in contrast to Europe, for example, where you have the blue zones and even an odd license plate days and all these other rules in cities that do strictly limit from the top down people's ability to drive. But in the U.S., we've never dealt with, and I think it's politically impossible to accomplish, dealing with the private automobile in a way that folks aren't allowed to take them where they want, when they want. And your perfect ideal little fleet of communicating, swarming, buzzing, automatons that all work together in one system is knocked for a loop if one guy takes his F-150 through the middle of it, right? So, or at least many guys. And I'm saying guys because I think it's more likely to be men who are the problem here. So my enthusiasm for autonomy is dulled, or I should say eliminated, by the expectation that we'll never have enough government control to make it happen.
Okay, so you're saying we're not going to limit where the human-driven vehicles can go so that way they don't interrupt autonomous vehicles?
I don't think individual municipalities in the U.S. are going to enforce an autonomous-only system.
Oh, I don't think that's not our. So that I think that's a misconception. I don't think that. So like right now, I guess there are laws in place where you couldn't ride your horse down, 6th Avenue. I do think someday in the future that will be true once it's been proven how dangerous that is to do. But I think in the beginning, autonomous cars will live with human-driven cars.
Driving amongst them. I mean, that's how they're being tested now. That's how they are expected to have to work. So I don't think that any city is going to, I think it will be the opposite. I think that we are going to limit where or how or when autonomous vehicles can go, or more specifically to a city planner's perspective, how fast and specifically how fast they can go. I mean, and that's, you talk a lot about using paint and traffic calming, which I think are very useful tools when we have to deal with a human driver who is essentially an evolved ape behind the wheel of a 6,000-ton automobile, to have to slow them down. We can't just say, slow down. You have to slow down here. We're Americans, we're not Germans. And so we don't necessarily always follow those rules. But an autonomous car, I can say, at every point along a road, you're going to be traveling 10 miles an hour, then you're going to slow down to 9.6 miles an hour. We don't even have to use miles an hour anymore. We can use feet per minute, feet per second, whatever. You can get down to really minute levels of detail. And that can also be part of the traffic calming solution. Having a slow driver on the road, while it makes people annoyed, it does tend to slow down traffic. And I think that's kind of what those people driving exactly the speed limit are endeavoring to do to some degree. And it does slow everyone down. Well, of course, it leads to people passing, but you can also be doing that with autonomous vehicles where you say, in these particular places, you are going to be going slower, or use the advantages of having cars that are completely covered with cameras and say, if you count more than 6 pedestrians on the sidewalks or crossing streets, or if you see a child because school has been letting out, or you see 6 children, you will slow down for the next 5 minutes, or you will slow down within this particular zone. And we might implement a system where we can tell all of those autonomous vehicles to slow down, and that way you wouldn't even have to program in school zones into, we do have that. You have the flashing lights, and it's August now, and I drive past my school and there are the lights still flashing in the middle of August because they didn't program in the dates, and of course nobody is slowing down to 20 miles an hour because we all know that. But you could make autonomous vehicles very intelligent while still living within the realm of non-autonomous cars.
Well, and I guess this is where I think we actually agree more than we think so. It's just that there's a few early arguments that aren't understood well enough. And so I think we've created camps. And I think those camps are unfortunate.
And detrimental.
And detrimental. I think this is a lot like when horses were in New York City and the automobile was coming. And we didn't really plan for the automobile. We all just kind of said, well, automobile, how could that possibly be replacing the horse. So we ignored it to our own detriment. And I feel like that's exactly what's happening now. We have a bunch of technologies that are coming, but because we don't really fully understand them, we're going to ignore them, and then it'll be too late.
Well, yeah, and I'd like to focus on where we agree because I think there's a lot of interesting technology that I'd like to share with your audience that they might not even consider technology, but the work that we're doing in cities now to make them more walkable, without autonomous vehicles changing the mix, but certainly if autonomy comes, and I'll still say if autonomy comes, it's like the singularity, right? Someday. If autonomy comes, these changes would be very helpful as well. And that is how many American cities are realizing that it's basically the speed of the vehicle that's the great danger to pedestrians. You may be aware we have an absolute pedestrian death epidemic in the U.S. right now. Well, if you read my new edition, you know that, and a lot's changed in the 10 years since I first wrote the book. Over the last 14 years, the number of pedestrian deaths per capita in the U.S. has doubled. And that's a function of a bunch of different factors. One of them is how many people without cars are now living in sprawl, because poverty has kind of moved to the outer suburbs. This concept of moving further and further away from the city until you can afford a good place to live means that a lot of neighborhoods that were, it's generous to call them neighborhoods, a lot of zones that were originally designed only for driving are places where people who have no cars are now living, and that's extremely deadly. But secondly, and more significantly, the rise of the SUV and the fact that these vehicles have very high hoods, the number of front-over accidents, where someone's killed by a car rolling over them has gone from like 5 a year 20 years ago to about 350 a year. Now, when you're hit by an SUV, you go under the vehicle, you don't land on the hood. And of course, the difficulty in stopping them, the sheer mass and momentum of them is probably the biggest contributor to this factor. And a lot of cities are recognizing that, whatever the vehicle, it's a, what would you call it? I guess it's a geometric relationship between speed and injury. So a car, I'm sorry, I'd like you to meet someone who just moved my camera, and you can edit this out or keep it, but this is Queso, my 17.5-pound cat, and I'll put the camera back where it was and continue. A car that's going 35 miles an hour is about 7 times as likely to kill you as a car that's going 25 miles an hour. So cities are changing the details of their streets in order to make it natural for people to drive at these lower speeds. And what's really interesting, and it's the great black hole in traffic planning. Well, we already talked about induced demand, which is the way that the traffic engineers add lanes in order to reduce traffic, which has been proven to never work, is one way in which the traffic engineering profession fails to understand that environment influences behavior, right? People respond to their environment by driving more if they have more lanes to drive in. The other way that they fail to acknowledge that environment influences behavior is when it comes to safety and speed. And that's because traffic engineering in the US grew out of highway engineering. And so all the rules that make a highway safer were then applied to our city streets. Now, how do you set your speed on a highway? You look for the speed limit. If you're like me, you set your cruise control for 9 miles an hour over the speed limit, right? So your speed is a function of the speed limit. If your speed is a function of the speed limit, anything you can do to reduce opportunities for conflict, anything you can do to create elbow room or reduce friction is going to make that highway safer. So what can we do? Wider lanes, no trees, clear zones on the side of the road, right shoulders, no opposing traffic, one-way traffic, no intersections, no parked cars, big, long, swoopy turns as opposed to tight intersections. Those rules that make highways safer were then brought into our cities in ignorance of the fact that you probably know yourselves. When you're driving around a city, what determines your speed? Well, you're observing your environment. You're getting a sense of how much elbow room you have. You're getting a sense of whether there are people or houses or other things around. And your speed is entirely a function of your environment, not the marked speed limit, right? So for 50 years in this country, probably longer, we designed streets that actually cause people to speed up. And because of this geometric relationship between speed and injury, drastically increased the amount of people getting killed in our streets. So when we go into cities now, we make very simple changes that actually don't even necessarily, guys, reduce the capacity for cars. You know, we turn 12-foot lanes back into what they used to be, which is 10-foot lanes. A 12-foot lane or a 13-foot lane, that's a highway width lane. That's a 70-mile-an-hour lane, and yet many of our cities have a 12-foot lane standard that we're slowly pushing back in city after city down to 10 feet. And of course, I'm talking about urban areas. In residential areas, you can have a little narrow 12-foot street that handles traffic in both directions. You know, many of us grew up on streets like that in our older cities. We get rid of one-way networks. I'm not sure, well, I know where you live. Lowell, Massachusetts, a city that is near both of us, they had done what hundreds of American cities did during the 60s and 70s and turned their two-way networks into all multi-lane one-way streets. So Lowell had a big street going this way and a big street going that way. Multi-lane one-ways give you the opportunity to jockey. They make you a different kind of driver because whatever lane you're in, the other lane is faster, right? You have the opportunity to go faster. Very different way of getting around. I've worked in about a dozen cities now where we've converted or are in the middle of converting these 1980s or 70s one-way networks back to their original two-way configuration. One more thing I'll mention is signals versus stop signs. If you think about how people behave, how you behave as a driver in an intersection that has a signal versus one with a stop sign, most of our cities in the U.S. are over-signaled. I just did a plan for downtown Hyannis where we're removing 11 out of 12 of the signals in downtown Hyannis. Because think about it, you know, at a stop sign, you're never speeding up to beat the red light. And no one is ever going through, and I'm talking about always stops, very importantly, not one-way stops, but always stops, where every intersection now is approached as a negotiation. There's a lot of eye contact, pedestrians rule, bicycles usually just blow through, which is good and bad. But that's the sort of changes we're making in cities that are making them much safer and actually much better for business in the downtown because people are going through the city now, looking around, window shopping, and thinking about perhaps stopping and pulling over, as opposed to picking which lane is the fastest or waiting for the light to turn green.
And I mean, I would agree if the argument is based on humans, then I totally agree with you. All those things are good things because you've done this for decades and you know how humans work. So that's great. But we're missing, I think where we're not connecting is, and you said this early on, you said, if autonomy happens. And that would be to me like saying if automobiles happen as opposed to horses. It is going to happen. It is happening. It is just one of those things that is hard to see it completely happening until it has already completely happened. And it's going to be one of those things I believe will happen overnight. Once it starts to happen, once you can show that an autonomous car is safer than a human, we will all say, oh my God, we don't want 30,000 people dying on the roads every year anymore.
And forget safer, cheaper. If it's cheaper for me to not own a car, because as you've mentioned, it's a very expensive thing. Not only, and sure, I'm only paying a certain percentage of it, but I think for a lot of people, it's a huge portion of their expenses is owning a vehicle. A perfect example of this is Uber. Uber was, what was its big thing? Oh, it's slightly more convenient because I can order it off of a phone, and it's slightly cheaper than a taxi. We had taxis for decades. We almost threw them out entirely overnight because there was this one company that was going to do this thing with this promise. And we just went along with it because it was just slightly cheaper and slightly more convenient. You add in the same amount of convenience factor and now make that probably a tenth the cost. I just don't see how many people are going to be able to justify owning a vehicle. What I'm saying right now is let's start to be thinking about autonomous vehicles and pass laws, I would say, against them. Even though I'm like pro autonomous vehicles, I want the city planners to be thinking about and planning for the eventual rise of autonomous vehicles before They're multi-billion-dollar industries that we're going to have. How are we going to fight them?
Well,
how
I don't think you mean against. I think you mean how we can incorporate them into our cities.
Right. I mean, I'm not saying, yes, it's not against. I'm not trying to stop them. I'm trying to...
That's very important to us. And I think, when you speak about a immediate, when the curtains open and there's an embrace of it, or a transfer in technology, you speak of it being immediate. That's what we see city planners would hope for, because what we're very wary of is this partial autonomy scenario, which is the worst of both worlds, which the engineer Sam Schwartz, who invented the term gridlock, they call him Gridlock Sam, he wrote a book about anticipating autonomy, and he's very worried about cattle gates in the middles of intersections. Jaywalking is actually one of the things that makes walkable cities great. People are just strolling through the street everywhere, not just at intersections. If we're going to pass some laws, and right now I would add many cities are not many, but certain cities are welcoming experiments in autonomous vehicles without many laws in place. If we're going to have laws in place around this adoption, I would like to see laws that make sure that no pedestrian or cyclist ever has their rights curtailed in order that these partially intelligent vehicles can have free reign. You guys are probably aware of V2X technology, right? Vehicle to everything technology. And these V2X chips, the federal government is currently helping to fund a program that would give us chips that we would wear on our person or perhaps have in our phones so that the cars don't hit us.
No, the key there is, you said federal government.
Right.
So I don't think that that's really going to be the leading technology.
No.
And we aren't hearing about any of this within Cruise or Waymo or Tesla. They're not looking for any kind of chips. They are looking for people.
Right.
And everything else on the road. They have to, it's this long march of nines. They have to make sure that if a moose wearing a bikini is walking down the street, that the car is still going to come to a stop.
Right.
Which is a huge challenge, but is going to hopefully mean that it is a very capable vehicle.
Well, and then I just want to maybe push Jeff's mind one step even further and into the land where you're definitely going to think I'm crazy. So we all know that when the airplane was being developed, most people would have argued that we would never see the day that we have today. We have 38 million international flights before COVID. We had almost 1 billion people each year traveling across the world.
Right. And there was that famous, I think it was Wall Street Journal article that had come out.
New York Times.
New York Times that had come out 9 days before Wilbur and Orville's famous flight. And it said that airplanes wouldn't happen for the next millions of years.
Right.
They said it was just that impossible.
So what I think is going to be happening in 10 years, again, this will sound impossible for a lot of people, is that Starship, that crazy looking rocket that Elon Musk is developing, will probably be traveling intercontinentally, meaning that I will be able to go from New York to London in 29 minutes for the cost of about $1,200. And again, if I'm crazy and if I'm wrong, then it's meaningless to talk about. But if I'm right, then pretty soon we will have even more international travel, because who wouldn't want to go to London for lunch? I would. And so we'll be having people, more than 1 billion people traveling around the world. And so what looks like traffic problems today around airports is going to seem like nothing compared to this new problem that we'll have. I would love to hear that urban planners are thinking about that, but I get the sense that because it's such a seemingly far-fetched technology that we're not even thinking about it.
Or that it's just so unpopular to talk about that no one's really wanting to think about it and put ideas out there.
And I mean, if we just go back a decade talking about, if you had said that SpaceX would be bringing 80% of mass to orbit, I would have been laughed out of any room. And yet today they are beating China, they're beating ULA, they're beating NASA. They bring 80% of mass to orbit. This guy who knew nothing about rockets is now doing that. So I just wonder, is that something that's being talked about at all in urban planning circles, or is that not?
Not in my circles, I'll admit it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I should say that when you raise the issue of any sort of increase in transportation, I have to ask what the fuel is and what the impacts on the planet are, because I think perhaps this conversation hasn't emphasized enough the crisis we're now facing.
Well, that's the beauty of it. This is methane, so this is actually burning it, which is bad, but actually recapturing it, so it's actually carbon neutral.
Is the idea. Of course. And I mean, there are plenty of ideas that don't necessarily come to fruition,
right.
But it has been expressed that is his interest.
Right.
It's my job as a city planner to be about a 20-year futurist, right? and you may say this is going to happen in 20 years. I don't know.
I say 10, but yeah.
Most of the cities I work for are interested in seeing change within the political cycle, right? They want to see vast improvements before the next election comes up. So we don't necessarily look at such earth-shaking technologies, especially given the uncertainty. And I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, because who knows, right? I don't know. But I do want to say that I still think the best invention of all time, and I'm not alone, is the bicycle. And the idea of looking smaller and not larger, looking more individual and not societally, at what each of us can do to improve our quality of our lives while also lightening our carbon footprint, is perhaps a more successful, proven technique for addressing our current issues.
Well, then maybe we can find some common ground here on e-bikes. So Jesse and I just got back from a 40-mile e-bike ride yesterday. Mm-hmm. And I mean, if you had taken the E off of that and just said bike, then I would be in the hospital right now. So the fact that the E part let me do that and get some exercise, but also, I didn't come back dead.
Right. And this is after 5 days previous where we had biked from Boston all the way to where we live out here in Westford.
Right. I mean, they'd actually finished the infrastructure just a few weeks ago that allowed us to go, through Somerville and get out here, whereas before that would have been nearly impossible. What are your thoughts on e-bikes specifically, and maybe e-scooters?
I hate them. No, just kidding. Everyone loves e-bikes. Everyone should love e-bikes. The number one selling vehicle in the U.S. right now, or type of vehicle, are e-bikes. They are absolutely transformative. Early on, there were some hardcore cyclists in my peer group who poo-pooed the reduced calories expended per mile as, somehow wimpy and not legit. But that type of bicyclist, of course, has been obscured by all the people who are now biking not for recreation or to prove their macho bona fides, but to actually get where they're going. I have limited experiences on e-bikes, but I have ridden them around New York City and other places. I still like my acoustic bike perfectly fine, but I don't live in a particularly hilly place, right, or a particularly hot place. I think that, as many other people have said, that we shouldn't be subsidizing electric cars. We should be subsidizing electric bikes to really make a change in people's lifestyle. And there's some other e-trikes, right, that older people can ride without fear. E-cargo bikes are allowing people to get rid of the car or the second car. I have a number of friends who have traded their second car for e-cargo bikes. It's miraculous. E-scooters, of course, in the pedestrian world, there's a lot of complaining and yelling about legitimate injuries and even deaths that have occurred from e-scooters and e-bikes hitting people on sidewalks or just in streets. I always do remind people you are more likely to be killed by a vending machine than you are to be killed by a cyclist of any type out on the road. The statistics doesn't help if it's you or your loved one, but the statistics are very clear that they pose a very low risk. There's a real challenge around the non-speed limited e-bikes and e-scooters when they interact with regular bikes in bike lanes. It's one of those rare things where, as a city planner, I want to ask for more enforcement. But enforcement around transportation has historically been racist in this country, and if you pay attention to the outcomes of bicycle enforcement and even jaywalking enforcement, you see that it's not a good thing to do because of who ends up getting targeted and how it's used as an excuse to target folks for other reasons. So that's a real quandary we have in the planning world about how to see a future in which, or a present in which the e-bikes, aren't salmoning the wrong way, making deliveries down a bike lane where regular, folks are trying to just do their commute. We don't have an easy answer to that, but I do think that e-bikes and particularly e-scooters help us in a big picture way because they just point out the real need for what we now call micro-mobility lanes, right? Not bike lanes, but a real need in our cities for 3 scales of transportation on every street, at least that's not a highway or a rural road. Every street needs to be, and here I have an important point to make, every street needs to have a place for pedestrians, a place for cars, and a place for bikes. if the speed cannot be limited, then the cars and the bikes need to be separated. But, there's a wonderful trend in Europe, I'm sure you've seen it, and that we've accomplished in some of our streets here in the U.S., of what's called shared space, where the cars and the bikes and even the pedestrians are all interacting at very low driving speed. That has proved to be very effective at making downtowns wonderful, but you have to be very restricting in the dimensions so that the cars are not tempted, the drivers are not tempted to go faster than that.
I remember my favorite city in the world being Venice, and that probably is because there's no cars there. And so as a kid, my parents just let me loose. And there are, if you think about it, other roadways, which are the canals, but you're walking over them, over bridges. And so it's gotten me thinking. As a kid, I never really thought about it. But as an adult, I'm thinking we were living together with those boats that would have killed us if they were on the same plane as us, but we were walking over them. Why can't we have zones? Why can't we have, because even, Jesse and I just got back from Amsterdam, wonderful city, except that for the first 5 days as a tourist, you could get killed by a bike because you're not thinking like a bike. And so there's, they're coming at you. And there's little spots in the city which bikes are not allowed on and where it's just for walking, which are completely lovely. And I feel like if we got to some kind of zone, which isn't really shared space, it really does go pedestrian first, which would only be, let's say, 4 blocks deep, where no cars, no bikes, nothing other than walking was allowed. But then you can easily, because you're so close to it, walk to where your bike is or your car is and get onto a major thoroughfare. I feel like that would bring back what we all kind of want as humans, which is complete safety for our children. Kids can run around. We don't have to even think about it because the worst you're going to do is bump into another human walking. I feel like we just haven't allowed ourselves to go back to that, though. That, I feel like, is what we all would love to have, and that's why we all go to Epcot Center and we all go to these places where there are no cars. What are your thoughts on that kind of zoning? Could we agree to that?
Well, I wouldn't. Anyone who's been a parent, and Jesse, have you been a parent yet?
No.
But Zach, have you?
He's my kid, so yeah.
Oh, I didn't know he was your son. Wow, that's awesome. Good for you. So the experience of visiting a place that's a truly pedestrian street where you can sit down and have a drink or a meal and just let your kids run free, that changes your outlook a bit when you're a parent on how important these places are. Of course, Europe is full of them. In Boston, we have Downtown Crossing. Many American cities have small areas like this, and I'm often seen as the bad guy on this because I'm not quoted in full. So make sure you get this in full. But there were 200 streets in the U.S. roughly pedestrianized in the 60s through the 80s, and about 180 of them failed immediately. And they failed because in those particular circumstances, the shops were dependent on car traffic. And you kind of half quoted something else I say in the book, which is that cars moving slowly are the lifeblood of the American city. And I'm not saying that that's good, but that is a fact that we have to acknowledge in our cities right now. The lesson there is not to not pedestrianize streets, but rather to test it as you go. And, the mistake we made in the 60s and 70s is that people came in overnight and rebuilt streets very expensively in ways that cars couldn't get in, and it would be very expensive to unbuild it back to the way it was. These are the streets that failed. They were never tested, and they were built to an untested model. What Jeanette Sadiq-Khan under Mayor Bloomberg did in Times Square, and what a number of cities now, even some that I work with, are doing is, you bring in the potted trees, you bring in the beach chairs and the tables and the chairs, the regular chairs and the umbrellas, and you try it. And you try it for a Saturday, and if that works, you try it for a weekend, and if that works, you try it for a week, and you just see how it goes. It doesn't really matter. You don't have to do it expensively with beautiful cobblestones and other things. If these places are going to thrive as pedestrian places, it will be because of the density, the demographics. The climate is a factor, but certainly not the only factor. Success or failure will be proven with these tests. So I think every city should give it a try in the right place, and if it works, expand the hours, and if it really works, then make it permanent, and then make it beautiful, and then make it bigger, as many European cities have done. There's no doubt it's the best way to make a place, but I tell people to exercise caution, and I'm always telling people, don't do a study, do a test, and that refers to so many different aspects of urban planning. We want to put parallel parking back on this curb to protect it so this restaurant can have successful sidewalk dining. And typically the city officials will come back and say, well, we need to do a traffic study to see whether we can lose one lane of that street to put parking on. And I say, no, just bring a police car in and block it for not a day because people have to react, but block it for a week and see what happens. That's a lot cheaper than the typical $50,000 study that the traffic engineers would have you do. There's a lot of what we call tactical urbanism that people are doing these days to find out if things work or if they don't work.
I love that point because in the book you bring up so many examples of where almost every city or town has to do a traffic study first. I've been in town government for over 20 years. I know that is true. And I know that
they're always wrong.
They're always wrong. And so many times in the beginning, I was like, oh, the study says. And then as I got wiser to it, I would ask questions and realize that the answers were just from textbooks. And you're absolutely right. I feel like so many times, if it would have been way better to just put that police car in that lane, see what actually happened, you get way better results. Really good point.
Well, 50% of traffic studies are 25% off. 25% of traffic studies are 50% off. And the other thing that really is a problem with traffic studies is that they're often a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the traffic study presumes, it has base assumptions. For example, the traffic is going to grow 1.5% every year. Well, actually, if you plug your current street network into that model, it will fail in a few years. So God help you if you try to put a new housing development or a new coffee shop or something else on the street. If you have to do a traffic study first, the traffic study will tell you that you need to widen the street, of course, and then you widen the street and the traffic comes and they say, see, we told you so. But no, that was the induced demand that the widening provided. The number one thing we could do probably to make our cities better in the U.S. would be to stop doing traffic studies.
I totally agree. And the same thing as you bring out in the book about parking. So many rules about parking are just so wrong. They tell businesses they have to have a certain number of spaces per customer, and then they have to spend all that money to build them. And then a lot of times they're just using numbers that I don't even know historically where they get these numbers. They're generally wrong. And so either you've overbuilt some parking structure someplace, or you've underbuilt it, and usually overbuilt it, and to the detriment of the downtown, which now has just this big, ugly garage.
Because then you've either overbuilt it, and that means you have to plow more spots and paint and repair, and that means that whoever is paying for it, whether it be
us,
well, it's always us, of course, it's always us. But I mean, if that business can't operate, then now you have kind of what's even worse, which is not an operating business and a parking lot accompanying nothing, which just turns into.
Well, and I wanted to ask you, Jeff, during COVID, we got this one good thing out of it, right? Which was that a lot of cities kind of let restaurants have some of the sidewalk back, or even a lane of traffic back, and we had cafes popping up and restaurants popping up, and so many places loved that. Now COVID's over, so we're seeing that a lot of that's disappearing again. Can you talk about, did we learn anything from that? Did you get any traction that you didn't have before to explain how this might be a positive?
Well, I think I made a mistake, which was to take advantage of COVID to sell my ideas based on COVID. So let me elaborate. So there was a point where a number of cities like mine, Brookline, were removing driving lanes, pushing the parking into the extra driving lanes, and then widening the sidewalks, adding bike lanes, doing other things. It was very successful. And the city of Boston, the mayor was not progressive enough for the taste of the city council. And so the city council decided to have a hearing to discuss this issue, and I was the first presenter at that hearing, pro bono, just giving a talk about the situation. And I said, look, COVID is at its heart a spatial crisis, and it has a spatial solution. We're told to keep 6 feet away from each other. We can't anymore. We need this extra space to spread out. So, this crisis demands this change. But smarter people like Mayor Hidalgo in Paris, who's done amazing things to reduce the amount of driving and parking in Paris, she said, this is amazing, with these COVID lockdowns and other things, and no one driving, we can hear the birds sing, and we're breathing fresh air. Wouldn't it be wonderful if cities could be like that all the time? And they essentially doubled down on their, dare I say, kind of anti-car approach to the city. What we're seeing now in American cities is some really cherished and wanted to keep the changes to the infrastructure that COVID brought about, and others kind of in a reactionary way have just let it go back to where it was before. On the whole, it's been tremendously positive. The liquor laws in Massachusetts changed so you could serve drinks out on the sidewalk like that. Some of the handicap restrictions that made it very hard, and got in the way of you just placing a little wood wedge against the curb, which by the way works perfectly fine. Those were relaxed for a while, and people saw that what was possible. So I think as planners, our overall assessment of the situation is it's a pity that a number of those changes have been lost. A number of the what we called open streets, which the drivers called closed streets, have been reverted back. But on the whole, it's been a net gain, and I think people's eyes have been open to the possibilities in a more universal way. I was going to read you a passage from Freud. I think about these things. I try to think about these things in a very elevated and big picture way, and not looking deep into the future, but looking deep into humans and the past as well. And I was really, I learned a lot from a book called Technopoly by Neil Postman. And he quotes Freud in the book, and Freud says, "If there had been no railway to conquer distances, my child would never have left his native town, and I should need no telephone to hear his voice. If traveling across the ocean by ship had not been introduced, my friend would not have embarked on his sea voyage, and I should not need a cable to relieve my anxiety about him." And the idea that Postman brings up in the book is the technological imperative, which essentially says that any new technology that improves convenience will be embraced, even if it's ultimately destructive to our society. And I think that the experience we've had with automobiles over a century has been one that may very well end humans' habitation on Earth. But no one thought about that early on, and it's very it gives one pause to think about whether we're adopting technologies simply for convenience that may in the end kill us, or at least make our lives worse.
Well, and I guess that's why, to me, the planning part of your job, I love, because it touches on the futuristic part, or the, where do we want this to go? It's telling a city, for instance, like, you don't want this because it's actually going to make things worse, and explaining that. And I think that's so great, because as you pointed out, like a highway planner just thinks, oh yeah, let's make this main street as fast as possible. And it's like, no, cities, you don't want that. You actually want the cars to go a little slower.
I do have a happy compromise, I think, in our arguments about AVs, which is kind of a put your money where your mouth is proposition. And that is, if the visionaries who are boosters for autonomous vehicles are correct, then there will be less traffic. And if there's less traffic, we don't need more car lanes. So the boosters of autonomous vehicles say that we'll have additional lanes available for, because there's no parking, there won't be any parking lanes. We'll have additional lanes available for bicycles and walking and all the great things that cities have to offer. And I say, okay, put your money where your mouth is. Let's see a worldwide pledge that the AV makers and promoters agree to, that we will not increase the number of lanes for traffic in any city. Because, and I call that legislate with lanes. I say to mayors and city managers, just make a rule that if AVs are coming, you don't widen the streets. Because if you're going to have to widen the streets for AVs, then something went wrong and it's not the technology you would hope for.
Well, and I think that's a good point, because, if you look at cars now, there's a prevailing wisdom, which of course is false, that you should be adding more lanes, or that you should be adding more places for people to park their cars and stuff like that. And it's self-fulfilling in that, once you widen the lanes, then more people are coming into your city, and you need more parking and you need more lanes, and it just keeps going and going. And I think that autonomous vehicles, they are cars. right? And I think that there shouldn't be any mistake about that. But the one difference, the one key difference is that people are not driving them, and they can drive away and go pick up somebody else, which again means that the parking will almost certainly begin to be reduced, hopefully, and that there will be places for these vehicles to be charged, cleaned, and maintained, but hopefully that's going to be a depot, which we have hundreds of already in cities, and can be on the outskirts and can be further afield and not in the middle to muck everything up, whereas a parking lot has to be now.
I actually think because of open markets, cities that don't do that are going to be the cities that lose their populations, and the cities that do take advantage of this free space, right? Turn their parking lots into parks and houses are going to do better. So I feel like you don't need any pledges; it'll just happen.
Because I think at the same time, luckily, we're getting this e-bike boom, as we talked about, and I think that it is super lovely and wonderful. And the biggest reason I would say, to go back to your point about how it's dangerous to have e-bikes that can go super fast in bike lanes, I think that the only reason that people really like the speedy e-bikes, or especially speaking from experience, is that I can ride along a road which is not treated for bikes at all and feel somewhat safer because I'm going 28 miles an hour, and the car coming up on me, it doesn't have that speed difference. They're going to see me for a lot longer. They're going to have to really wait to pass when it's actually safe to do so, as opposed to just trying to, get by me as soon as possible. As I hope, especially in cities where we're going to be taking what is, city streets are generally typically pretty wide, not necessarily lanes, but, you have the parking on the side. Once those get turned and converted into bike paths, I do think that there should be limits on e-bike speed, or at least either intelligently or through enforcement, which I understand has its limitations and problems. But
what we just saw in Somerville when we rode from Boston to here was that they protected us in those bike lanes. There was lots of turns, so we couldn't get going very fast. Mm-hmm. And so it did pretty much everything correctly, I thought. Like, we're not going fast, so we're not really going to hit someone who's walking across the street.
And in fact, it was the mammals, as you put it, the middle-aged men in Lycra, that
they were the most dangerous.
They were the most dangerous, mainly because accelerating for them is one of the most difficult
Yeah, can
parts.
we talk about this misconception for a second?
Yeah.
When you're on a one-speed bike, like they usually don't have gears, they have to be going 22 miles an hour. They don't want to stop or slow down for people, and they're the ones who are yelling at you as they're approaching, on the left, who are going way too fast when they pass you. On an e-bike, I can slow down to 5 miles an hour, pass you leisurely, and then accelerate past you.
E-bikes cause people to obey stop signs when they're biking.
Yeah.
When otherwise it doesn't make sense to do that. And by the way, obviously I'm a big fan of the Idaho stop rule, which is starting to spread across the country, that allows you to treat a stop light like a stop sign and a stop sign like a yield sign, which is how most bicyclists behave anyway. There's this misconception that grew out of the vehicular cycling movement of the 1970s that a bike is just a smaller car, and that bicyclists, even though they pose much less threat to other road users than drivers, should somehow be beholden to all the traffic signals and signs that cars are beholden to. That's a preposterous concept that was accepted at face value and dominated the discourse for many years. But I agree that e-bikes make it an easier proposition. One thing I want to share with you about technology is that we're finally caught up with Europe, or I should say where Europe was 25 years ago when it comes to bike facilities. So I remember in the 90s in Berlin, as a pedestrian, observing the sort of bike lanes that we're finally now able to build in American cities. And you probably saw them in Somerville. But the latest, greatest, which we put in all of our new projects and which are promulgating or proliferating in Somerville and in Cambridge, is that you have the street, you have the parallel parking, then you have the curb, then you have the bike lane up on the curb, then you have some trees, and then you have the pedestrian area of the sidewalk. And the surfaces are very clearly treated so that people know which is which. This is finally becoming the standard that cities are requiring of developers when they build new streets, because principally it is developers who build streets in American communities. And that's wonderful to finally see that happening, alongside the concept of shared space where everyone's going very slowly.
I'm going to throw a curveball in here, which is, we just talked about e-bikes, but what about micro cars? Because
Oh yeah, those little L6.
now that we can
and-
make everything electric, the spectrums between, normally you need a vehicle. Now we get, little bubble cars that, in the United States are limited to 25 miles an hour because it came from golf cart communities wanting to be able to drive their cars on the roads.
So you're talking LSV, low speed vehicles.
At the moment, they're LSVs. In Europe, we have L6 and L7, which are, 27 miles an hour to roughly 45 or 50 miles an hour. Lower-ish speed vehicles. They don't have much in the way of crash requirements or airbags. Kind of what are your thoughts on those? How do we are we going to mix those into American cities? Are they going to just become more popular, or are we going to be stuck with our SUVs and sedans, or are we just going to move straight to autonomous vehicles when it comes?
Well, I think, first of all, L7 is also a very an excellent punk band, if you remember back in the 90s. But you kind of hit my punchline, which is it's these golf course communities and these retirement communities, like the villages down in Florida, that actually, without any intellectual thought or, academic planners involved, said, we're really going to shape ourselves more around this golf cart technology. And now you see that coming more and more to places where it's safe for that to happen. I think, who knows? I'm the wrong person to tell you where the market's going to go in this regard, but I can reach the bright conclusion, which is that we need to not create streets, or I should say we need to modify so many of our existing streets in which the geometrics are clearly demanding of the driver higher speeds that make these other vehicles unsafe to use in the same place.
You mentioned in the book that you lived in Miami for a while, you worked there, and that you really loved your neighborhood, but that at some point you really wanted to take advantage of all of Miami. And you said before you are a car lover, and so you got yourself a car. And I'm curious about that part of your life of I feel like that's a very American thing to do, right? When you've got the money that you get yourself a car if you can afford it. And then you kind of have a bigger area now opened up to you. You could now go further afield in Miami. Isn't this another problem of urban planners? I feel like they do, which is they kind of treat a lot of people as the NPCs of the world, the non-player characters, and they kind of put onto them they should act like this. Whereas most Americans, as you kind of just pointed out, they want to live a certain way. I don't know how to put a finger on it, but they want the mansion, but they also want the downtown. They kind of want the best of both worlds. So they see the car as the way of doing that. Oh, I'll have my mansion out here. I'll drive into the city so that I can work or play. And that's where we kind of get stuck, right? Is that we now have to make both these worlds work.
And of course, it's not a mansion. It's just a single family home,
Right.
but it's as close to the mansion as we can get as
Right.
we work our way up the socioeconomic ladder.
Right.
So the first of all, it's worth saying that urban planners as a profession is pretty ill-defined. And so when you say urban planners, your audience might think you're talking about some cabal of, black cloak wearing people who all, preach from the same Bible. And there's actually, a lot of different people doing urban planning in different ways who come from different backgrounds. I personally wasn't even trained as a planner. I was trained as an architect. So the first thing to acknowledge is that it's not a monolithic group of folks. The second thing is that I believe that and I think most urban planners who know what they're doing believe that no urban planner, it's the urban planner's job to avoid creating a condition where anyone needs to tell anyone else how they should behave, but rather we want to create a framework in which people are able to live their best lives by making the choices which are best for everyone. So the classic planning scenario is the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons is that old story where everyone brought their cattle or their sheep or whatever to the town common too much. It was overgrazed, and then all the cattle died, and then the people. What planning does is it tries to create circumstances where individuals, in maximizing their own utility, are also benefiting the whole as opposed to just themselves. Because in the long run, we all rely upon the whole in order to survive. So I don't ever tell people how they should run their lives. I have a car. I enjoy using it. I've reached a point in my aging and wealth that I can afford to have a car that I principally use just to go to New Hampshire. I don't need my car very much during the day because I also have the ability to live in a community which has great transit, has good bike facilities, and allows me that freedom. I want to give that freedom to as many people as possible. That's why you see planners advocating for more bike lanes so that more people can get around the whole city without taxing the air and the roadways. And we're advocating for more housing, more affordable housing in these wealthy communities very close to Boston. We didn't talk much about the national housing crisis we have, which is extreme and is a function of many factors, but planners historically through zoning have been part of the problem, not the solution. And we also didn't talk about the fundamental changes that are now, let me rephrase that. There are some fundamental changes now happening in American cities around planning issues that are quite earth-shaking and very positive. One of them is the elimination of minimum parking requirements, so that when you turn a piano shop into a restaurant, you don't have to immediately find like 20 more parking spaces where none exist, which of course stops you from doing it. And of course, as Donald Shoup, who wrote The High Cost of Free Parking, says, the on-site, in other words, on your private property, the on-site minimum parking requirement is a fertility drug for cars because it just causes much more car ownership and car use in an induced demand sort of way. And then also, city after city in the U.S. and states as well, acknowledging this housing crisis we're facing and changing the rules and eliminating or modifying single-family zoning, which covers more of the planned landscape in America than any other type of zoning, and basically enforces a limitation in housing, such that just the right to put a house on a piece of property in the state of California is valued at more than $300,000 because of this artificial shortage. Well, it's a real shortage that's been created through artificial means around our housing market. And which, by the way, is the principal cause of our homelessness crisis in the U.S. There's a wonderful book called Homelessness as a Housing Problem that identifies housing, real estate market scarcity as the principal cause of homelessness, as opposed to all the other, ways that we blame the homeless for their problems. Anyway, so these two big changes around parking and around housing are having a major impact on how our cities grow, and I think it's a positive one.
And I think, if I can unfairly piggyback on that, I think that autonomous vehicles could, by removing parking altogether, should be lowering the actual parking requirements. Where the rubber meets the road, truly there needs to be a car parked here, and whether or not we plan for it and put a space.
Right. I want to give kind of two concrete examples. If I want to open a restaurant now in some downtown area of, Baltimore or, Los Angeles, right, parking's a huge issue. When that's no longer a big issue, that reduces my cost to, my barrier to entry as a restaurant.
I want to use a local example. If you live around here, you've probably been to like Newburyport, and Newburyport has this, I guess, wonderful parking lot where people from outside of Newburyport can come drive into the downtown of Newburyport, park in what is essentially a 2-block parking lot, pay for parking. It's reasonably priced. I'm sure it's, of course, subsidized. And then they can walk around beautiful Newburyport, but it takes up a huge amount of space. And while it enables Newburyport to kind of have this tourist zone where people can come in from wherever and park, it does take up an enormous amount of space.
Well, I'm smiling because it doesn't just take up a whole lot of space.
Yeah.
It's the waterfront. And secondly, because I was hired by the town of Newburyport to work with them to try to sway the community around their rejecting a very nice developer's proposal for that site. And I was involved for a whole year, probably about 4 years ago. I was involved for a whole year with the city trying to help convince the people of the city, trying to modify the proposal so that it was more palatable to the city, and then trying to show the city how good it was. Ultimately, though, the political process was such that the people who already lived there had no personal reason to accept that development. And who shows up, and this is one of the flaws in American governance, who shows up at these public hearings? Of course, only the people who have a personal interest,
group. Yeah.
AKA the NIMBYs. And so ultimately the whole project was killed. and there's still a big parking lot as
No,
a
you bring up a
waterfront
really good point.
in Newburyport.
Having been in municipal government for over 20 years, I mean, it's great that if something's going to happen in your backyard, you can show up and talk about it. But it does, you have a vested interest in stopping whatever that is, whether it's a rail trail or whatever. We just, the other day, went through a rail trail and it was great for 10 miles. And then we had to stop and go this long, convoluted route to get back to it because one parcel of land wouldn't let you ride on the rail trail. And yeah, the NIMBYs do get to kind of control American politics a lot of times.
And I just think that autonomous vehicles will, I hope, and I know that it will take work.
Well, it could solve the Newburyport problem
and cause a little bit more of an egalitarian and economic.
Well, because
it'll relieve some of the pressure on the parking requirements.
Well, because that developer, whatever that development was going to be, could probably take place there because parking won't be an issue in Newburyport anymore.
Right.
For a number of years, my colleagues, not so much me, but my colleagues who I would work with on plans, would use the promise of autonomous vehicles to convince cities to not build parking structures. And that was about 5 years ago to 3 years ago. And then, the AVs weren't coming as fast as people expected. And now I don't hear that argument as much. And I don't know how convincing it is to folks as much. But definitely we would like to see, as you suggested, Jesse, we'd like to see those parking spaces put to productive use as opposed to how they're currently used. I want to bring up one more point, though, which I didn't get to share, which is that, again, stepping out, big picture, 30,000 feet. The problem with cars isn't that they pollute. It's that they equalize the landscape. What I mean by that is that before cars, when cities were basically built around transit, you had nodes of activity and places of concentration. And it was natural because transportation systems determine settlement patterns. It was natural for people to grow their cities in dense ways, which provide all the benefits when it comes to more business success because people are bumping into each other in the street. Of course, lighter footprint because people aren't going great distances, but especially lighter infrastructure. It takes much more pipe to serve 100 houses in single-family lots than it does to serve an apartment building, right? So the David Owen, who wrote a book called Green Metropolis, and I'm going to paraphrase badly, he said the problem with cars isn't the Hummer in the driveway. It's all the things that the Hummer enables and makes possible or necessary, including all those extra miles of asphalt roads, all those extra miles of electrical wire and plumbing and sewage, and just the natural kind of spreading out and fattening of the American property. And then the fact that you've got this is my addition, you've got the 2-car garage, but does the car go in the garage? No, because you have to fill the garage with all your toys. Why do you need so many toys? I would argue it's because you don't know your neighbors like you used to, and your lives are empty. Yeah. Because you have the anomie of sprawl, which has been very well documented. It's not just a literary conceit. People are much more lonely in suburban areas than they are in city areas, and we have this new epidemic of loneliness that everyone's talking about in the news just this past month. So the biggest problem that we city planners, who are, I think, the ones who are thinking about it, have with cars isn't going to be fixed by switching to autonomy, by switching to batteries, by switching to anything, because what they do is they spread us out, which hurts us environmentally and hurts us socially in a way that no technology can change. So that's kind of the bare bones foundational understanding that prompts a lot of the advocacy that we bring to this.
No, because I agree with a lot of that. I do agree.
Totally.
I mean,
I think that especially, it's almost as if the speed, it really is the speed of the car that is what you're saying is being able to get from one place to another. I mean, when we e-biked the other day and we had traveled the 44 miles to our house, we were like, we live a long way from Boston. Like, it's not 44 miles directly. We had to stick to the trails, but you get this sense of distance that you don't get in the car when you're flying at 60, 80 miles an hour on the highway, which is, it's cool. But it, as we have learned, there are so many effects that the car can do. And I think that it's going to take a lot of bending with autonomous vehicles. And I think the only positive thing is that through regulation, we could hopefully bend the autonomous car to better fit our world to make a better, better cities and also better towns.
And we should factor in the things that are very hard to factor. I mean, you can't put a price tag on what you just pointed out of like, I love that stat you actually had of if you have a slower street, you're going to have 3 friends versus a fast street, you're going to 0.9 friends. That's at least a number I can wrap my head around where it's like, oh, I would much rather have 3 friends than less friends. And if that means living on a slower street, great.
Right. And as we were riding our bikes through Somerville the other day to see, the back ends of lots and also apartment buildings be right on the rail trail, and you're going like, man, I want to live here, because then I would know, I'd be able to sit outside, watch people on their bikes, be able to have a conversation with people who are walking their dogs.
I could commute to work.
That way.
The real estate values support that, and there's a lot of good data you can show to those folks who want to stop the trail going by their house. And by the way, I've heard in 2 separate public meetings someone say, people are going to come out from the city on their bikes and steal my television. I've actually heard that twice. But these people object, thinking it will harm them. In fact, the data show very clearly that real estate values near rail trails are much higher.
Because it's pretty hard to carry a TV on a bike. It's much easier, actually, to put it into an SUV for those potential thieves out there.
The problem that technology doesn't solve, and I think that what we planners get upset about because it takes all the air out of the room, is this excitement over electric vehicles, which, yes, do reduce emissions. And this excitement over autonomy, which, yes, will, if successful, will save lives and potentially be more efficient, a more efficient use of our urban space, doesn't address the principal issue. I would call atomic, not autonomous, but atomic transportation, where everyone has their own vehicle, spreads us out in unhealthy and unsustainable ways. And that transit connects us back together into settlements that are just healthier, happier, more efficient, and greener. That's something that isn't discussed enough.
Yeah, well, it's great that we're starting the discussion, and hopefully we can continue it as technology, goes down the path and we see where it's headed. Jeff, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. I urge anyone who's at all interested in urban planning to read your books, to get your books. Walkable City was a delight to read, full of really interesting case studies. You've worked on so many of these cities yourself, so you had a first-person view. This isn't like an academic thing. You've actually worked in this field, which was so great to get your perspective on. I hope we have you back sometime, maybe when autonomous cars are driving around, and we can get your take on that. Who knows?
Well, I hope to be young when that happens. Let me just mention to your viewers that you can still buy the old version. So when you go online, or particularly online, make sure you get the version with the stripe down the side, because I just did a 10th anniversary update that has 100 new pages that talks about COVID and autonomous vehicles and Uber and other things. Not all of which I know you agree with, but they're certainly fun to read.
Yeah, no, lots of good stuff in there. Thank you so much, Jeff. This has been a real fun talk with you. And again, I hope you have you back soon.
Great. Well, nice talking with you guys. And maybe you can pop down to Brookline sometime.
Nice, on our e-bikes.